Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and we finally get some class changes over for the Season 3 content of War Within. Some actually significant enough buffs for so many different playstyles, but also adjustments for both PvE content as well as PvP. Really, with Blizzard going after some of the more egregious bursts within PvP content, while also trying to make certain other playstyles a little bit more viable in dungeons and raids. A lot of us were expecting these kind of changes last week, but because of the Labor Day holiday, it looks like they delayed them until this week. But it's definitely really good to see additional tuning, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw even more class changes over the next few weeks. There's a lot of stuff to go over, so I kind of want to jump into it as soon as possible, but I am going to leave chapter marks down below so you can skip around to the most relevant section for any class that you're the most interested in. As always, if you guys want to keep up with regular updates for the War Within as the season goes on, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. Real quick, before we actually dive into each and separate every one of the classes, we do have a general PvP change that is going to come to the Trinket combo bonus. Whenever you're running the PvP Trinket set, you get yourself additional primary stat and stamina, and it looks like they're increasing stamina globally for everybody from this Trinket set bonus by 5 additional percent. So normally it's stamina increased by 15%, so that's getting amped up by 5 as well. So it looks like they're trying to slow down the pacing of PvP combat by giving everybody a little bit more health to work with. So it's going to slow down the pacing of PvP, generally speaking, but not by much. It's just a slight adjustment for the season. From there, though, we finally have classes like Death Knights. So we're going to go over the classes in an alphabetical order. For Death Knights, we're seeing a buff for Blood Death Knight. First of all damage is being amped by 6%, which is really good. I felt like Blood DK damage was a little behind some of the other specs. They also are buffing the Bone Shield armor, the actual Bone Shield armor gain by 10%. So it's going to be slightly better physical damage taken as a Blood Death Knight as long as they have Bone Shield charges, which I think is going to be fine. I'm pretty sure they nerfed this before 11.2 release, and now they're going back to buff it back up. A little unfortunate to see, but this is overall a slight gain for Blood Death Knight, and one that I think was very much needed, especially when it comes to Mythic Plus content. From there, we have the spec of Frost Death Knight, which are primarily getting PvP adjustments to few abilities. Specifically, they are nerfing the damage amp of Shattering Blade, reducing its damage by 50%. So it's going to be some nice Frost Strike burst that Frost Death Knights have been able to play around with in this season. That has been reduced by a solid bit, specifically the interaction of Shattering Blade and the damage it provides for those Frost Strikes once you have 5 stacks of Razor Ice on the target. However, they are trying to give Frost Death Knights something in return. They're buffing the damage of your Frost Fever by 15%, which, I mean, there's not too many interactions with Frost Fever specifically as a Frosty Death Knight. It's just a little bit extra passive damage that can hit multiple targets with your Howling Blast, able to cleave multiple enemies. It's just going to be a nice bit of like passive damage at a cost of some of your burst. So I guess it's going to kind of sort of even out at the end of the day. Another spec that's receiving some buffs is going to be the Balance Druid, with Druid's getting a couple of changes. It looks like they didn't have to shut down the Druid Discord just to bump Boomkin single target damage, which is what they're looking to improve. Overall, a damage amp for Balance Druid is going to be a 5% raw buff all across the board. But this does come with certain reductions within certain gameplay elements, specifically when you play as the Elune's Chosen. That tier set has seen slight reductions overall. With the tier 2 set, the Starfire damage increase has actually been reduced to 15% instead of 20%, so it's a slight reduction there. But also, the Elune's Chosen hero talents are getting reduced as well. Boundless Moonlight's Fury of Elune flash damage is being reduced by 10% for balanced druids specifically, so thus for druids that are speccing heavily into the Fury of Elune playstyle. But also the minor moons called from the full moon part of the Boundless Moonlight, the minor moon damage is also being reduced by 10% as well, so it's just overall a reduction to Elune's Chosen. And as the PvE set of changes, however, Boomkits are also getting a couple of PvP adjustments. PvP Boomkins playing Keeper of the Grove, the main core ability of Dream Surge, is receiving a sizable nerf. Keeper of the Grove Dream Burst damage, which comes from the main ability of Dream Surge, is being reduced by 50% within PvP, heavily reducing some of the burst damage of Balanced Druids by a decent bit. So this makes maybe an opportunity for some boomies to potentially think that, okay, Keeper of the Grove, they're reducing its burst quite a bit. Maybe there's an opportunity to play Elune's Chosen now with this set of changes. Elun's Chosen is also getting hit as well, specifically the playstyle of Lunar Calling that increases your Starfire damage but only lets you go into Lunar Eclipse. Lunar Calling is also going to be reduced down to 80% damage jump for those Starfires instead of 128 that normally would be for PvP. So that's a sizable reduction there as well. So no matter whether you Keeper of the Grove or Elun's Chosen, Balanced Druids are taking a hit within PvP content. The only other spec worth mentioning is Feral Druids, which are actually receiving a buff for PvP. All damage is being amped up by 4%. Not a huge change, but it is definitely going to be one that's going to be somewhat noticeable when it comes to day-to-day combat. Next, we have the class of the Evoker, and all three specs of Evoker are actually receiving some kind of a buff all across the board basically. For augmentation, it's going to be the synergy with Scale Commander, specifically the main ability of bombardments. After a mass eruption, you mark the enemy for destruction, and you and your allies, when they attack the target, have a chance to bombard it, dealing a bunch of volcanic damage split to the target and amongst all other nearby foes. So they're buffing the damage of bombardments for augmentation by 25%, so it should hopefully make Scale Commander augmentation even more impactful overall. Devastation is also seeing some buffs as well, specifically to the main ability of Deep Breath. That is being buffed up by 20%, though only for PvE content, not affecting PvP specifically. And that should make it a little bit better as a Scale Commander, since they have a lot of effects and talents that interact with the Deep Breath mechanic, making it fairly potent. They also are buffing the tier set for Scale Commander as well, specifically the 2 set bonus. As part of the Evoker tier set as Scale Commander, you actually get a cool one, as you get to summon up these Evokers to fly by your side after using Deep Breath ability. And those 2 Drakthi Evokers will cast Disintegrate in single target, Empire in AoE, and they're actually quite effective. These Evokers' disintegrate damage, so single target damage, is now being increased by 10%, which should hopefully make Scale Commander maybe a little bit stronger in some situations. Finally, we have the spec of Preservation, which is also receiving some buffs as well. They, like Devastation, are also seeing a damage buff for the Deep Breath ability, buffed up by 20%, though only in content like Dungeons and Raids and not in PvP. However, they are still receiving a PvP adjustment either way, specifically when it comes to playing Preservation as a Chrono Warden. You get the Chrono Flame ability, which gives you an enhanced version of Living Flame that is enhanced with some bronze magic and has some bronze interactions, but it also deals additional arcane damage to that target. And the tier set interacts with it in such a way where whenever you gain the buff of Temporal Burst after pressing tip the scales, your Chrono Flame now can hit additional targets and repeat additional damage. That scaling of that additional amplification is what's being reduced this time around, however, where they are reducing the scaling of it down to 325% of your spell power in PvP instead of what was originally 450% spell power. So I can't really give you a number like if it's like a 20% nerf, 30% nerf, but it is a reduction to spell power, so expect that additional extra Chrono Flames and the damage amp from the 4 set to be reduced significantly heading into the next week. The next class on the list is Hunter, and they're actually buffing up Beastmaster Hunter, specifically with a big focus on the Dark Ranger playstyle. First of all, they have an overall damage buff all across the board by 4%, though only for PvE content and not in PvP, which means in Dungeons and Raids they're going to be a little bit more effective. They're also updating the talent of Deathblow, where Kill Command will now have a 20% chance to proc kill shots instead of 10%. So that's going to play a little bit better with execute-based playstyles and really just end up synergizing super well with Black Arrow, since that replaces your kill shot execute as like an execute but also an opener and a regular combat ability. From there, Dark Ranger is also receiving a number of improvements as well, like the talent of the Bell Tolls, which allows Black Arrows to increase your and your pet's damage by 6% for 12 seconds. That is now being amped to 10% damage amp, so it's a nice little bit of a damage amplification to make Dark Ranger a bit more consistent. Pain and Pain Cleaving component is now also being buffed up for Beast Mastery, where it'll now do shared damage to 45% of the original value instead of 30%, so a sizable cleave improvement for those kill commands. And they're also buffing the Blade Powder damage overall by 25%, though this is only a PvE adjustment and not one that's going to affect them in PvP combat. Besides that, we only got the slightest adjustment for Survival Hunters for PvP specifically, and they're just taking the ability of Flanking Strike and reducing its damage by 20% in PvP. So just a nerf for Survival, and that's really about any amount of changes that Survival is getting this week specifically. Next, we get the class of Mage, and it looks like they're making primarily PvP adjustments for the spec of Arcane. One of the things they're trying to do is trying to reduce some of the severity of the burst and one-shots that come from the ability of Arcane Barrage. As right now, Arcane Mages have a lot of tools in order to supercharge the Arcane Barrages to be extremely potent, and they're also reducing some of the burst severity that comes from playing the Sun Fury playstyle. Though without really... They are at least trying to give Arcane Mages back a little bit in return from some of these nerfs, so while there are some nerfs, there's also going to be some buffs as well, in order to try to compensate for these changes. To reduce some of the power of that Arcane Barrage, talents like Arcane Harmony is being nerfed. Arcane Harmony will now stack up by 2% per stack instead of 5% in terms of its damage, with 20 stacks maximum. That's a hefty reduction in its buildup of damage from the Arcane Missiles. The talent of Intuition baseline is also going to be reduced quite heavily. Instead of increasing the damage of the Arcane Barrage on a random proc by 50%, it is now going to be by 20%. So most mages will kind of combine it together with Aether Fragment for 20% additional damage buff. So this reduction does help reduce its burst severity quite a decent bit. Then there's also interaction with Improved Touch of the Magi, as well as the PvP talent of Nether Flux. Nether Flux replaces Touch of the Magi, basically making it so the next ability that hits the target hits it by, I believe normally it's 40%, but Improved Touch of the Magi will add 25% on top of it, putting the ability up to 65%, which stacks it quite a decent bit. The reducing Improved Touch of the Magi, when paired together with Nether Flux, however, to only increase its damage by 10% instead of 25%, so yet another breakdown of some of that burst capability. However, they are increasing the damage, the raw damage of Arcane Mages overall, by 6% in PvP. So while your burst is being reduced, your overall damage does go up a little bit to help compensate a bit. Also, Sun Fury in PvP has been seen as a bit of a problem, so they are doing some reductions here as well. Like Glorious Incandescence buff towards the Arcane Barrage is reduced from 20% down to 10%. Yet another way for them to try to split up that Arcane Barrage damage. Even the Sun Fury Meteorites that you get to call, but also the Meteorites called by Glorious Incandescence, that damage is being reduced by 38% within PvP. Then also the actual Phoenix themselves, when they cast abilities like Greater Pyro and Arcane Surge, the damage of both of those Phoenix-based abilities are being reduced by 33% within PvP. So overall, it looks like Arcane Sun Fury are getting gassed down a little bit this time around with a Tuesday-Wednesday reset. From there, we have the spec of the class of Monk, specifically focusing on the spec of Mistweaver. First of all, for PvE content, and I guess general content, they ended up fixing a bug where the capstone of Coalescence was not able to interact with the ancient teachings, or I guess not Jadefire teachings, but the baseline ancient teachings talent from the Mistweaver tree. Where baseline ancient teachings allows you Tiger Palm, Black Kick, Rising Sun Kick, and Crackle and Jade Lightning to heal injured allies for a portion of their damage done. And of course, you can amp it up together with the Jadefire teachings so that damage to healing conversion becomes a lot more potent. Yeah, so that whole damage to healing component was just not interacting with Coalescence in a way, so it should hopefully overall allow for a little bit better throughput healing. However, when it comes to PvP content, there's also one more change. They're actually taking the damage of Russian Wind Kick and reducing it by 50%. Rushing Wind Kick was really strong when it comes to PvP content, and the amount of damage it did was actually kind of huge. Landing a crit with a Russian Jade Wind Kick could potentially take someone's head off, so it looks like they're trying to make this ability a little bit less deadly. From there, we have the class of Paladin, where Retribution is receiving some PvP adjustments, specifically when it comes to the Templar playstyle and the Hammer of Light ability. Hammer of Light's damage is being decreased by 15% within PvP. I think this is mostly them trying to attack one of the more burstier elements of Retribution Paladin, and Red Pally is the most popular melee class right now for PvP content when it comes to overall. Like when you take all the different PvP brackets, Retribution Paladin is a big standout of most melee classes and in general most PvP classes in the game, just in general for the season. So it's going to be them trying to, I think, reduce some of the burst elements. However, I think a lot of Paladins are just going to pivot from Templar into Herald, where the damage of Dawnlight, and in some cases can actually be even better than Hammer of Light, is just a lot more passive, and it can cleave multiple targets instead of just hitting one target with all of its might. From there, we have the class of Priest, and it looks like they're trying to make Holy as an Archon build a little bit stronger through a number of changes. First of all, they're increasing the effectiveness of your basic heal where healing is increased by 12%, though only for dungeons and raids, and that heal does not affect them in PvP. Another heal they're also buffing up is the healing effectiveness of Halo, empowering it by 40% more healing, which is sizable, and of course synergizes super well with Archon, which has a very natural Halo interaction where Halo can pulsate multiple times. They also are buffing the Archon's base gameplay of empowered surges, where Halo can manifest surges of light, and point below that with empowered surges allows those flash of light heals or flash of heals empowered by surge of light to now be 45% more effective instead of 30% more effective. So it looks like they're really trying to bring Holy Archon a little bit more into season. As Discipline Priest, they're actually making a change to Atonement. They're increasing its overall healing by 33% of the damage done instead of 28%. So this is mostly going to help them out within raid content specifically. However, Atonement healing within smaller groups, so outside of raid, is being reduced down from 125% increase down to 100%. This is mostly to help out their Atonement healing within raid content, and may potentially make Void Weaver a little bit stronger as it leads heavier into that Atonement based healing, but we'll see if Oracle ends up taking a backseat or if Void Weaver ends up being just the more potent option overall. However, Disc Priests are also receiving one PvP adjustment as well, as their shields, the actual absorb of Power Word Shield, the absorption effect is being buffed by 20% in PvP, which should be quite sizable. Next, we have Subtlety Rogues, which are receiving some PvP adjustments. First of all, Subtlety's burst is being lowered down quite a decent bit through the ability of Shadow Blades. Normally in PvP, Shadow Blades allows you to gain 10% more shadow damage from all of your abilities. They're actually reducing the burst damage from 10% down to 5%. So your burst window is getting a little bit softened overall. However, they are increasing the overall damage of Subtlety Rogues by 6%, so all of your base damage abilities in PvP are going to hit slightly harder, which should hopefully give you a little bit better mini bursts and potentially even damage outside of that huge burst window of Shadow Blades, possibly giving you more opportunities to land a kill outside of that major cooldown. But yeah, your burst overall with Shadow Blades is going to be lessened by a decent bit. From there, we have the class of Shaman, where Elemental is receiving only a handful of PvP specific changes. First of all, they're buffing the effectiveness of their Earthshock ability by 15% in PvP. Also, they're taking the playstyle of Stormbringer, and to try to make that Tempest ability and Stormbringer just a little bit better, they're taking the damage of that Tempest and are amping it by 10% in PvP. So if you are playing around a big Elemental Tempest build, that potentially could maybe regain some value when it comes to PvP content. Lastly, we have the class of Warrior, with Arms Warriors receiving a slight adjustment for PvP content specifically. And by that I mean all they're doing is buffing your overall damage by 4% within PvP. No specific talent adjustments or any other specific ability changes, just a 4% damage buff, very similar to that of a Feral Druid, so it's going to be just making your character just a little bit stronger. But with that being said, as always, I don't want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like, as I would very much appreciate it. Be sure to join our Discord community, especially if you want to keep up with any future content updates like Midnight and Alpha, or potentially a release date for the patch 11.2.5 with the Legion remix announcement. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about all these class changes? And as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.